Over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. You take it from the short bio that I'm pleased to be back in the company of former colleagues and some very close former colleagues like Renette. We spent many, was it months or years, years in expenditure planning, and then also in public finance and the budget office with Andrew Donaldson. I see Michael has left, so worked very closely. So it feels amazing to be back, and also to be asked to come and facilitate a session at what has become, I think, a very prestigious economic conference dealing with issues around public economics and finance. So our panel, and it's not a panel of one. I'll introduce the other panelists, but it's a panel that's going to be dealing with all things energy transition, and having Jesse here with us, it will also not skip on the important aspects of justice in that energy transition. So like the other panels, we will have two presentations and then a panel of 4 people, yeah. We have one presenter with us in person, and that's Jess. And then there's a presenter online, Bernard Becker, who I will ask to go first with his presentation. And then we'll go into a panel that will be Jess, Bernard, Shamila, Subramani from the National Business Institute, as well as Vukile Davidson, who's at the National Treasury. So maybe just to, in fairness to everyone, say quickly where they're all from. So Jess is from the University of Cape Town. I was asking her if she's a chemical engineer because she's located in that department. And I think if she had said yes, I would have felt a lot more inadequate in a company. But she said she's actually an historian, and having worked with Jess, I think we need more historians like Jess. And then we have Bernard Becker, who is from the University of Stellenbosch. Vukile Davidson is in the tax section in the Treasury, and as I said, Shamila is with the NBI, former JSE. Bernard has a bit of a time constraint, so I'm going to allow Bernard to go first. And I take it that he is already online and that his presentation is up and ready to go. Yep.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the introduction. Can I continue?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Yes, so I would like to share technical views with you. I'm an electrical engineer, so I'm feeling a bit out of depth here in a public economics, public finance forum. So I'll keep my comments strictly in the technical area. What I would like to share with you today is a view on the challenges of integrating renewable energy into our power system. There's obviously a lot of opportunities, but there's also risks, and I think it's very useful to just understand these aspects clearly. So the problem, I think, is very clear. I understand that's also why we're running late. Load shedding is definitely a massive problem at the moment in South Africa. I like this graph that was published in Business Tech, which just shows by 2023, sort of mid-May, we already reached the same amount of blackout time that we experienced for the full 2022. And it doesn't look as if load shedding will be a thing of the past very quickly, although I'm sure there's a lot of very talented people working on fixing all of this. But that's definitely the problem, and engineers like problems. So that's why I also like my presentation to start with that. Renewables, according to South African policy, is very much part of the solution looking into the future. There's a lot of small graphs here, which I hope you can see adequately on the screen there. But if you look at the top left graph, it shows our aspirations that has been sort of captured in the Integrated Resource Plan from 2019. Unfortunately, that's the latest one we have, where it basically says that every year the green bits are wind, and the yellow is PV, and then blue is battery. Every year we would like to add around 1.5 gigawatt or more of wind, as well as PV. That comes to almost 2 gigawatts. So that's a nuclear power station, a Gtac nuclear power station every year we need to add to our network if we want to be within our policy guidelines or our policy aspirations. So that's a massive amount of renewable energy that's going to be added onto our networks. You will also see the TDP, that's the other two graphs there. You can see the generation capacity in 2020 and 32. So 10 years from now, you can see there's a massive percentage that will come from wind and that will come from PV. So given these sort of aspirations, what's the issues? Let's have a look. The issues start with load shedding, and the government decided to really incentivize behind the meter solar PV. So solar panels that's put on residential and commercial roofs is strongly incentivized at the moment through government messaging. The National Treasury has provided a energy bounce back loan guarantee. There's tax incentives, etc. So that's definitely clear. So there's a belief that this will hopefully help with load shedding. And we can actually see the results. I'm showing here again from 2014 to 2030, the renewable actual build and aspirations of what policy says we must do in the future. So again, this is a lot of renewables. The red block shows what has been planned in policy for the past 5 years. So let's see what actually happened. And just for the reference, the yellow in this case is utility scale PV. So the contribution from utility scale PV, that is through our REAP program. And the red bits or the orange bits are behind the meter PV, i.e. these are private people installing their own PV at their own cost. If you look at what actually happened, there's a massive difference. You can see, I'll just go back to the previous slide again so that you can see. Previous slide, there was a plan from 2020 to 23 to add a lot of wind, a lot of utility scale PV, and a small bit of private PV. What actually happened was that we didn't add almost any wind or PV at a utility scale due to various reasons. But in 2022 and 2023, when load shedding really hit us, we added almost 10%, well, actually more, 4.7 gigawatts out of a system of around, 35, 40 gigawatts. So we added more than 10% of our generation capacity behind the meter, i.e. these private solar installations, which is actually concerning, and I'll talk more about that. But the fact is that it's definitely booming. These numbers are estimates that we received from Eskom, but it's supported by research that is done. This was published by the reference that I'm showing at the bottom here, where you can see the first quarter and second quarter of 2023, the number of imports into South Africa of solar panels, lithium-ion batteries, and inverters, it is booming. It is really off the charts. And while load shedding is continuing, I predict that it will continue. It might flatten at some stage. But this gives you some sort of idea of what's happening on behind the meter space. The question is, will it solve load shedding? So we are definitely successful, or government is successful in their messaging to put more PV on the roofs, and it's happening. Is it actually a good idea? If you look at what happened in Germany, Germany led the solar PV revolution in the late 2000s, just by putting really high incentives for rooftop PV into operation. And what you see here went from blue to red is the two of the biggest utilities, electricity utilities in Germany, what happened to their annual results. They basically ran into serious financial trouble. The reason is their revenue was eroded through customers generating their own power. So that's one of the risks. Let's have a look at what else could happen if you look at other countries. So one of my students did a big literature review on the typical issues that you see once you start moving from 0% renewables, which is on the x-axis on the left-hand side, all the way up to 100% renewable. The more renewable energy you put onto your network, you get benefits, but you also get new challenges. The first challenge arises related to constrained transmission. And we see this in China, we see this in Australia, in Europe, in America, wherever you look, there's some facts that you can look at. Constrained transmission, it means there's not enough space to put all the renewables on the network. And that's exactly what we're experiencing now. We're sitting in 2022 at about, I can't see that far, 13% of our net or our generation capacity in terms of energy being renewable. And if we plan to move according to the policy aspirations to 2032, where we're going to have 40-something% renewables, we're going to sit with a different problem, which is constrained flexibility, i.e. our power system will not be able to easily move up and down to handle the demand and the renewables that we're seeing. And then everyone is already worrying about constrained inertia, but that's something that's only happening past 50%. So not a big issue at the moment. But it's just useful to look at what's happening in other countries. Why am I telling you that? Because I would like us to think about this, specifically the behind the meter solar PV revolution, and whether that's going to solve load shedding from three aspects. The financial viability aspect, hosting capacity, as I said, the whole idea of how do you get enough renewables onto our network, and then flexibility. How do you run a future power system technically with a lot of renewables on that system? So jumping right into financial viability. Financial viability for municipalities is actually a big question mark. There's a lot of questions around whether, if you take away the main source of revenue for a municipality, which is electricity sales, by encouraging people to generate their own electricity, will that not cause them to fail financially? There's a balancing act here, and it's shown in the little diagram on the right-hand side. Sure, if you install PV, there will be a reduction in revenue that the municipality will see, because you are reducing the sales volumes, and you're also having to pay people if they start pushing excess photovoltaic energy back into the grid. But that is balanced by a decrease in costs for you as the utility. Firstly, you sell less power, so which means you have to buy less power from the upstream utility, which in this case is Eskom. You have a reduction in technical losses. What that means is because you have less wires, you are generating at the same point where you consume the power. There's not a lot of lines in between. You actually lose less. And that can be significant on the distribution network, the amount of energy that you're losing or money that you're losing with lines heating up. And then lastly, when you buy from your customers that have excess PV to sell, you now buy from a cheaper source. So you buy cheap energy, which you can then sell on to another customer, and thereby you actually have more of a profit that you can make. So balancing those two are important. And we did an actual calculation where we looked at 3 municipalities, and we looked at how they would react to a growth in behind the meter solar. The first municipality did nothing. They just kept their tariffs as is, which means residential customers just pay a very high rate, or just a rate for their energy that they use. They have no fixed fees. And these customers are demonstrated here in the red line on the right-hand graph, where you can see the more of these customers in the municipality that does nothing to change, that uptake PV, the worse the financial situation of that municipality will come, because their utility revenue will just decrease continuously. From the customer's perspective, it is a beautiful financial proposition. It's a total no-brainer to install PV on your roof, because for every kilowatt hour that you generate, you can actually get 2 rands and 3 cents in this case for every unit of energy. And if you export, even better, you can get still the same amount of money. So this customer pays for their 100,000 rand system within 5 years. They're smiling all the way, and the municipality is becoming bankrupt. Utility 2 introduced fixed charges to offset their reduced sales, but Utility 2 did it by just keeping almost the same or making sure that their fixed charges cover their fixed costs, i.e. the cost that won't go away if you don't sell electricity. For example, just maintaining your network, paying salaries for your technicians, etc. But they then reduced their kilowatt hour rate to actually compensate for this fixed charge. This municipality did it in such a way that they broke even. So no matter how many extra PV panel customers come onto their network, these customers go onto a different tariff, and as such, the municipality breaks even, and the customer still gets a decent payback of around 10 years. So they'll still consider doing that, because you also don't want to totally disincentivize people to do it. The third utility really went overboard. They kept their old energy charges, but they just added the fixed charge. And now for the customer, it's really not worthwhile putting PV on their roof, which is also what you don't want to incentivize. So just showing this whole idea of a sustainable transaction is something where all the parties win. So I think that's important. Sort of key message for me is your electricity pricing design in a area where lots of renewables are to be added must be fair, and it must also be responsive to this fast changing sort of scenario. Then if I move on to the second question or second perspective that I looked at, it is the whole idea of, is there enough space on our network to accommodate all of these renewables? So just quickly, the energy transition is very much about a paradigm shift technically from central generation, where everything flows from a central power station to an end customer, to distributed generation, where at your house you might have a battery, you might have an electric vehicle, you might have solar panels, you might have flexible demand, which means power is actually generated and consumed at the same spot. And it's a totally different design philosophy from a technical perspective. And if I show you differently here, if you look at where most of our power stations are at the left here, and this is our transmission network, you can see that currently it's still very centralized. 80% of our total capacities all still sits in coal in Mpumalanga and the north, and then from there it gets distributed. But it will need to adapt. Another very concerning aspect is, you've probably all seen the picture on the right-hand side, which comes from Eskom's transmission generation capacity assessment, connection capacity assessment, which basically just says where in South Africa can more renewables be connected in 2024. And the answer is, in the Northern Cape, where most of the sun is, you can't have any more connections by 2024. In the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape, by the way, those numbers are now close to zero for both those provinces, where all the wind power is, you can't connect any more wind. Which basically just highlights we need to think carefully. We need to model properly to actually get past this hurdle. But hosting capacity constraints is definitely something that we can't ignore at the moment. There's many ways of moving away from this. Ultimately, you need to build more infrastructure, which is what is highlighted in this diagram. That's number 3. But you can also optimize your existing transmission capacity by actually doing all sort of things like adding renewables in areas that might be less resource ideal, but it might be closer to the load. There might be many reasons to actually just update your thinking around where you place your renewables. And you should also try and maximize the amount of generation capacity. that you can connect at any specific location by considering putting PV and wind, for example, together, because they might be complementary. In the evening, the wind blows, and in the morning or in the day, the sun shines. So you can add to the same piece of network. But it requires a technical shift in terms of paradigm, how you think about curtailment, etc. Okay, but I'll try and not go into too much detail. The hosting capacity constraints, in essence, the key messages is we need a lot of modeling. I'm obviously pushing my own agenda, but modeling is what informs the future, so we need to understand that. Many of these things, it's probably visibility and control of inverters. These are things that are important, because if you have a lot of different resources that's focusing on the same grid, you need to be able to kick off and prioritize. And for that, you need to know what is happening and how to control it. We need updated regulations that can help people to put the right things on the networks, etc. I don't want to go into too much technical detail. The last thing I want to focus on is, so we talked about financial, we talked about the fact that there's not enough space on our networks, or that's an important aspect of integrating lots of renewables. The third aspect is system flexibility, where we want to, in a power system, electricity power system, we need to make sure that the demand and the generation, the supply and the demand, must always meet each other. It's not like a warehouse where you can store the electrons. It needs to be used immediately. And that's what is meant by flexibility. If you have a coal power station as an example of a generation technology that's not very flexible, it's very much like your braai, like a beaver braai. If you want to have high heat quickly, you must get a different type of braai, because you will have your coals and you can sort of blow and you can give it some more air, and in about 10 minutes or half an hour, you'll have higher heat when you need it. But then also to kill your fire, or to make sure there's not so much heat, except for getting a hose pipe, there's not much you can do. You must just wait. So it is a slow responding baseload type generation technology. Nothing wrong with that. It's part of a big mix of generation technologies. But you need to understand, if you start bringing more and more renewables on, you need more flexibility. And that's why everyone, when talking about future renewable power systems, are very much on the gas side, which can be compared more to a blowtorch, where you can easily switch it on and off, and you can vary the heat very, very efficiently and quickly. And then renewables have their own issues in terms of flexibility. Renewables can only ramp down. What is meant by that is, if the wind is blowing at a certain speed, you can't get more out of your wind turbine than is available from the wind resource at that point. You can definitely curtail it, i.e. you can get less power from it, but you can't get more. There's many ways of getting around that by actually operating your capacity not always at its maximum level. So let's say there's a lot of wind, you actually keep some of the wind turbine power in reserve in case you need to ramp up. So there's many ways of getting faster flexibility, but it's basically an issue that needs to be carefully considered. What is, however, very important, and I'm not going to maybe spend time on this, just want to show you in terms of curtailment what is. Now let's go to this picture. What is important, let's say you now have your coal power station, which can't move quickly. You have your demand, which need to be met. Something's got to give. So let's say you have a ramping, or you have some sort of minimum generation where your coal power stations can't generate less than they're currently doing. They're at their minimum generation before they switch off, which means you can't curtail them less. So something else needs to be curtailed then. So then we can curtail the wind, or we can curtail the PV. So we can, even though we have all that PV and wind available, we must take away from that to ensure that our coal power stations then switch off. In such an event, the unfortunate reality is that the grid, shall we say that the utility scale PV would be one of the very easy things to curtail, because we have full visibility of it, because it's big plants and they need to report to the system operator, and we can control them. Due to our regulations, we must be able to control them. Compared to this massive red area that we're now adding every year to our network of behind the meter PV, the private PV, you can attest for yourself. If you have a inverter or a battery at home, Eskom has no control over that inverter or that battery, which means they're totally blind. It can't be curtailed. So even though they are probably sitting in some sort of take or pay situation with the utility, they can't actually, they'll have to curtail that energy and continue to pay for it. So that's just one of the issues of having a lot of small inverters which you can't control. I hope that was understandable, because it is quite a technical argument. But I think the last slide is just to then say, in terms of system flexibility, what we need urgently is an updated IRP. We need modeling to inform our decisions. And as you could see from the difference between reality and policy up to this point, that needs to be receiving urgent attention. Okay, but thank you. Sorry for running over time.
Thank you very much, Bernard. I was asked to cut you off halfway through your presentation, but I think the overwhelming feeling was that we should allow you to continue because of your really valuable contributions and information in your presentation. Bernard can be with us till about 3:15. So I'm thinking, why don't we go straight into Jess's presentation, and then I'm sure we'll have some time at the end, because there are lots of questions that I'm sure we'd want to throw at Bernard. I mean, I have a couple as well. Jess, are you going to
get a podium? That's exciting. Thank you. Can you guys see that okay? If it's there. Cool, thanks Neil. So I'm Jessie Burton. I work in something called the Energy Systems Research Group at the
I wonder if you shouldn't just
trying to move it.
Because you may be blocking, or yeah.
Is that good? Okay. I work in something called the Energy Systems Research Group at the University of Cape Town. My colleagues spend most of their time doing the long-term energy planning modeling. And I'm going to show you a couple of things. I'm going to talk you through some of the work that we've done, some of the work that the other modeling groups working in energy in the country have been doing, and what that has shown about future energy pathways in South Africa. I'm going to focus on the short term to 2030, although we mostly go to we do a lot of work going to 2050, looking at net zero scenarios. And then we're going to jump into just transition a little bit. So it's a lot, but I hope it's a bit of a change of pace, but it should be good. So key messages, if you forget everything else I say today, these are the most important ones. From a climate change perspective, the world is not on track to limit warming to well below 2 degrees or 1.5. This is really critical, especially for Africa, because we face the gravest physical impacts of climate change, and it will offset all of the development gains that have been accruing over the last decades. Secondly, technology costs in this new energy system that Bernard was talking about are falling very rapidly and are often the lowest cost option. So that's really good. It's making it cheaper for us to transition. It's making it cheaper to cut emissions. In the South African context, it's very clear that new coal power is much more expensive and much more emissions intensive option than alternatives. And it's also becoming more clear that the early phase out of coal for South Africa, which is consistent with global trends and global models, is a very cost-effective mitigation option. We're going to need a lot of investment. I'm going to show you some mind-blowing numbers in the coming slides. And that's a really critical question, I think, for economists who are dealing with public finance and the finance sector more generally. And beyond just the infrastructure and the technology, we need to be thinking all about the social impacts of this transition. How much is it going to cost to support workers and communities? I mean, I've been devastated today listening to all the challenges facing the public economics kind of policy community, and I'm about to add another problem to your plate. So it's development challenges, and it's climate change challenges, and it's energy transition challenges, and it's just transition challenges. Final problem, there are huge financial challenges to deploying at the scale that we actually need in everything, in getting kit, in building wires, in the amount you need for education and skills development and SMMEs. And this is really acute in just transition projects. So in projects that are really socially ambitious or trying to do something innovative, it's much harder to get financed than anything else. And I was thinking based on this morning's discussion, really the critical question is, how do we build climate compatible states? Like how do we build a state that delivers justice in the context of the low carbon transition? So I suddenly thought maybe not everyone reads climate change stuff all day, every day. This is from the emissions gap report, and it just shows you how far off track we are for 2030 to limit warming. We're going to be roughly half too many emissions in 2030 is what we need to be for 1.5 degrees, 20 gigatons, 20 billion tons of emissions. We're making progress. So from 2010, it's really improved because technology costs have come down and there's been action and there's been kind of, especially in the power sector, some countries are transitioning, but it's an enormous gap. For 2 degrees, it's a little bit less. And these are the NDC scenarios, right? So these are the targets that countries have put forward. Whether countries are actually on track for the targets, very different and worse. That's current policy scenarios up at the top. So we're way off track. When we hit 1.5 degrees, you start to trigger a lot of really, really difficult physical impacts, and we start to hit the limits of adaptive capacity. One of the biggest problems is that at this stage, although it's historically not just, it's going to require action from all countries. We have to reduce existing emissions, and we need to avoid future emissions in places where it can be done. And so the really big question is, how do we get technical support? How do we get tech transfer? And how do we get the finance that is needed to developing countries quickly enough? This is some positive news, yay. Global trends in technology costs and uptake have been going the right way. So across the top, you've just seen, this is photovoltaic, solar PV, onshore wind, offshore wind, CSP, and batteries. And the gray bars are just the fossil fuel-based comparator. And you can see the costs have come down dramatically for especially PV, but a little bit for onshore wind. It was a more mature technology. Offshore is a little bit bumpier. Batteries are dropping precipitously. And what's happening in line with that is that uptake is growing enormously. So that's amazing, but it still leaves us with a 20 billion ton CO2 emissions gap in the next 6.5 years. Similarly, this is from the IPCC report, and what's interesting about it is it just shows you where those bars are blue next to that technology. It means deploying this technology is actually cheaper to mitigate those emissions than it would be if, using the old fossil fuel technology. So a lot of these interventions are cheaper. That's great. It's especially in the power sector, so wind and solar, but also in transport. So public transport can be a cheaper option. Electric vehicles can be a cheaper option. So you have these nice opportunities to align a whole lot of development challenges. Sometimes these also create more jobs. You can address air pollution. You can address climate, but it's not uniform. In some sectors, it's going to still cost us money to do the kind of mitigation we need to do, especially in industrial industry and in areas where there aren't really commercial alternatives yet. They're still being developed. So learning R&D is going to be critical. So this is a 30-year process. In South Africa's case, though, it's clear what the cheapest options are in the power sector at least, and that's where most of our emissions reductions in the short and medium term need to come from. So I'm going to show you very quickly some of these pathways. My colleagues are wild. They've done like 80 net zero scenarios. They've got 100 scenarios I'm going to show you. I don't want to talk through every single one, but show you some general trends about what climate action really means for the South African energy system, what meeting our own targets means. So for people who are not familiar with the group's work, we run a model called SATM-GE. It's the South African Times model. It's linked to the SAGE model. I think that was Treasury CGE, so that you can see some of the feedback between a really, really detailed energy model. And that energy model starts with population and economic growth and appliances and households, and it builds you the least cost energy system subject to any of the constraints that you impose on it. And it's linked through prices and investment and other things to the economy-wide model. What do our emissions look like right now, and where do we need to go? So these are greenhouse gas emissions for South Africa. And what's striking about us is if you look at other countries, we're a huge outlier. We've been looking at how we're an outlier in jobs intensity and labor absorption. We're a huge outlier in our dependence on coal as well. We're the most coal-dependent country in the G20. It's very unusual for countries to get 86% of their electricity in this way from one thing. And we also rely on coal for liquid fuels and industry and exports. And so we have a lot of concentrated risk around one fossil fuel. What's interesting is that across all the modeling groups in the country, there are at least 11, and actually that number's from 2021, so there's probably more by now, local studies showing that new coal plants are not competitive and they wouldn't be part of a least cost system. So the IRP 2019, which Bernard showed you earlier, it policy adjusted new coal plant into the mix because there wasn't yet a jet plan. So it said, we don't know how to manage this challenge yet. But what we find in all of the modeling from all of the groups, from NBI and BUSA, from UCT, from the CSR, from Meridian, is that it actually becomes more costly when you add new coal. And you can close some of the old coal faster, not in the immediate term, but in the medium and long term. And it will not cost you much more. One of the really interesting studies done under SA Tide actually showed that if you keep limiting new renewables, which is what is in the IRP 2019, you end up with more job losses in the broader economy. You have higher electricity prices and you have a GDP knock across multiple sectors, but not the coal sector, obviously. So protecting coal comes at a cost to other sectors. CSR have shown, they've done a whole lot of different scenarios, and they've basically shown that you can afford to reduce emissions dramatically between now and 2050 at tiny, tiny incremental costs, and in fact, and sometimes at negative costs as well. And I just want to make it very clear, like coal plants are very important for energy security. This isn't we're turning them off tomorrow, although some are turning themselves off tomorrow. But we do need to plan this process. There are at least 15 mines closing in the coming years. The power plants are reaching the ends of their lives. There needs to be a very considered effort around managing that closure process. So I won't go through all of these, but I've put them in here because maybe people are really excited about this. This is some work we did where we compared under different scenarios what happens when you force coal into the power system. So if you tell a cost optimizing model to build you a cost optimal pathway, it never builds new coal. So you've got to force the coal plants in. And if you do that, it comes with extra costs over the period that they run for. And that ranges from about 20 billion, if you have optimistic renewable prices, a little bit more, to in a scenario where we also meet our own climate targets, our NDC, to just under 80, up to almost 120 billion. And that's because you end up having to close some of our older plants earlier to make space for these new coal plants. So it's not an effective use of scarce funding, and not an effective use, I think, of people's disposable income. This is the SA Tide paper I referred to, which just shows you, if you constrain renewables and you tell the model it can't build wind and solar, it has to build something else, it will build you some coal. Or if you do it and you tell it also can't make emissions, it will then build you nuclear, versus what happens if you just let it build what's cost optimal. And the difference ends up at about 2.2% GDP. The coal sector grows. So it's very clear what we should be doing. And like Bernard showed, we're behind on doing it. These are the other scenarios done by some of the other groups where they've kind of traded off the same questions. I won't go into the details of them. This is the NBI work, which also looked at the IRP and other ways of getting to net zero emissions. Net zero just means you're balancing the emissions in the sector against sinks. We have a land sink, for example, and they looked at the jobs and they looked at the cumulative investment needs across these. And what's interesting is that if you don't follow the IRP pathway, if you do something else, you actually get more net jobs, especially in the short term. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our NDC. Am I okay for time?
No, but
sorry. Okay. Am I doing a Bernard? For those who are unfamiliar, this is our NDC target range. For 2030, it's between 350 and 420 million tons. We're probably at about 450 or 470 now. So we need to reduce. What's really important is that in the multilateral regime, every country proposes what it's going to do, and it has to say why it thinks that's fair. And there's lots of ways of deciding what's fair. Every country has its preferred mode. But when you do an analysis using different ways of calculating fairness, our range at the very bottom is 1.5 degree aligned, and at the top is 2 degrees, but not all 2 degrees. So we really want to be focusing on getting to that lower range of the NDC. That would be our fair share contribution to this global challenge. What would that entail? I mean, this in fact doesn't get us to our low end. This is a net zero scenario done for the World Bank CCDR. What happens in the power sector is you gradually close the coal, you run a little bit of gas, you build a lot of wind and solar. That just shows the same thing in capacity. So you're building a lot of capacity of some things, but you're not running them very often, but you're turning them on like a blowtorch when you need to. This is interesting because this is transport. So obviously climate targets is more than just the power sector. We need to do a wholesale shift from oil-based cars to electric and public transport. I think we don't emphasize enough public transport in our work. And what are these numbers? We're looking at almost R1 trillion. 3 minutes. R1 trillion between now and 2030 needs to be deployed, roughly, and 4.2 trillion to 2050. Huge investment opportunity. And on the other hand, where's this money going to come from? How much will it cost us? I won't go into all the details of this. These are all scenarios that were run getting to different parts of that NDC range. The most important thing to note is how critical building new wind and solar is, a little bit of gas, and how we roughly halve the output of our coal fleet between now and 2030. It obviously changes in different scenarios, but you're looking at actually running these plants down a little bit, but not necessarily retiring them. It's really important to implement energy efficiency and demand-side management policies. It can save us 200 billion rand in supply-side investments, but we don't have a very institutionally rich way of actually getting these things done. So we're looking at R1 trillion in the power sector, in generation and wires for that low NDC scenario. And maybe that's a good thing. One last thing is just to say there's a huge renewable energy pipeline. So Eskom and the renewables industry have kind of combined forces to try and see how many projects are being developed. There are about 30 gigawatts of quite serious close to deployment projects going all the way up to more than 60 gigawatts, which is great because we need to install around 50 between now and 2030. But that's basically a scale up of 10 times our current installed capacity every year. That's what we need. We need to install our current capacity that we have installed every year in perpetuity. And we need to do the same thing on the grid, on the wires at about 8 times. That's the work that Bernard has been doing. And at least a doubling of foreign investment. Because one of the things we see is that as you become more ambitious, you start to soak up all the money in the economy. And that can be offset. Some of that macroeconomic shock can be offset by higher levels of FDI. My colleagues are working on that now in a second phase. I'll stop there, and I think we can talk about just transition in the panel.
Ooh, thank you very much.
Thanks.
You're going to have to move your podium again.
I can do that.
Thank you very much. So we'll bring the rest of the paddlers in, and confirmation that Shamila has joined us. Yes. Okay. But maybe before bringing in the panel, as the facilitator for the day mentioned, I'm working at the moment in a project management unit that is responsible for the implementation of the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. And we've come up against, I suppose, what one can describe as wicked, difficult problems. And I want to maybe just share the list of wicked, difficult problems that we are coming up against and maybe bring the panel in on that basis. Some of the issues they've touched on in the presentation, but as well as what is listed in the program as sort of the 3 key issues to be addressed. So South Africa is transitioning in the context of an energy crisis. We're also transitioning in the context of energy poverty, where households would either do have access to the grid, are unable to pay their bills and have their electricity cut off, and also fairly extensive illegal connections. So as Jess has said, massive investment is required in a policy decision that has been taken to be on a pathway towards net zero by 2050. The minister's announcement is that all new generation will be private. I mean, largely, but not exclusively, through the REAP. But for that, we need a transmission grid, a massive investment in the transmission grid. But coupled to that is a distribution grid that has something like a 200 billion maintenance backlog. So when you experience an hour of load shedding, there are areas that are going to experience a full day or 2 days of a substation going down, and that is as a result of um, the neglected maintenance on the distribution grid. And then in thinking about sort of the decarbonization, lots of negative press around Komati. And so, are we going to repeat the mistakes in the next couple of power stations that we're going to decommission? So a lot about sort of the messages, the perception, etc., and what this means in terms of in an increase in job losses. And then there's the whole aim to ensure that this transition is just. So maybe before we lose Bernard, Bernard, I was wondering if you can come in on issues around the transmission grid and just some of the work that you've been doing, both to look at, in the state of the grid, can there be further optimization of the grid? I mean, what would be a way in which we attract, if Eskom can now no longer borrow as the owner of the existing grid, and we start to look at off-balance sheet options or something similar to the REAP, what would that look like?
Okay, yes, thank you. I'm very careful to not provide information on things I don't know much about. So in terms of funding models, there's people that know more than me. I can just imagine that if you're a pension fund, an investment that you would really like is something like a grid infrastructure that is 40-year, it's a very long-term investment. So they seem to be aligned well, private funds or pension funds that can be addressed onto that. I think that the important lessons we should take from our REAP program, the Renewable Energy Procurement Program, is what happened to the prices. And I think it's still held forth as an example of an excellently run program where we started with 4 rands per kilowatt hour or really high prices, and it quickly went down as the banks started seeing, okay, we can actually, there's not so much risk in all of this. And I believe that if you were to, with all the caveats that I don't know much about public finance, so I'm just looking at that model and seeing what that did to renewable prices. Sure, there was also a decrease in PV cost and wind turbine costs, but in general, it makes it possible for investors to gain comfort that they can put their money here. I think one thing where, from my perspective at least, the REAP could have been more successful is encouraging local content and local just stimulating the economy. And I think that's probably an opportunity. If you're planning to provide billions, the opportunity to spend billions on transmission infrastructure, then make sure that the steel comes from here, that the metal comes from South Africa, that all the manufacturing, that we have the capability of doing this, rather than all the money just flowing out of South Africa and we're losing in that sense. But that's my very limited 2 cents worth on this topic. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Is Shamila on the? Yes. Okay, Shamila, let me bring you in as sort of former JSE and now the CEO of the NBI, um, where I mean your engagements largely with the private investor community. So how do we attract? I mean, we have policy certainty in terms of the REAP program, but also, I mean, how do we attract more private investment into this challenge of the kind of investments that are going to be required in the distribution grid, but also your thinking and your engagements with the private community in terms of investment in the transmission grid. And just to say that, I mean, the numbers are differing. What we are seeing is that ESCO can do about 200 kilometers per annum of transmission grid off their balance sheet. We need about 1,400 kilometers per annum in order to get to the 53 gigawatts that we require by 2030. And you were saying the US has what?
I think they have 3,000 gigawatts in
3,000
their
gigawatts.
interconnection
We
queue.
just need 53. Maybe we can do some wheeling. Okay, Shamila?
Hi, Neil. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Could you not save the difficult question for people with professor in their title rather than me? Just hearing. Can you hear me fine, though? Just checking the connection's okay?
We can connect. Yeah, we can hear you clearly.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So, Neil, my response there is that I think when it comes to the fundamental of what attracts investments, the basics are going to be the same. The requirements around policy certainty are clearly one of those that we need to have. And a coherent narrative, I think, at the national level that says, here's the policy, here's the enabling mechanisms that are in place that bring that through. In recent sort of conversations you have that I've been able to have with some of the international community, suggest that there is an appearance that we're a little bit schizophrenic as a country. We're not necessarily united on what it is that we want to achieve. Is it staying with coal? Is it moving on? Is it absolutely we're going to go on this trajectory and we're then building from there? So I think the coherence on the national strategy is going to be critical. And thank you to the previous speakers because they just had helped a lot with setting the scene and the slides on what is possible. And so being able to say we're committed to that trajectory. We might have a slightly different pathway in terms of the timing that it takes. And I've noted the comment in the chat. I can't remember, there was somebody that was talking about, needing to be given potentially more time on the pathways, for example. I think those are all valid and we need to do that. But the commitment needs to be there. It needs to be clear this is what we're committed to, and then create the enabling environment in terms of the different sectors that need to be able to do that. So on the obviously investment in the grid, I think once you have that commitment, it is far easier for that investment to follow. And if it is, for example, matching the long-term kind of view of a pension fund to be able to do that, even the pension fund needs that certainty because nobody's going to put member funds at risk without that certainty. They have fiduciary obligations in being able to protect the best interests of the members of those funds. And by the way, that's you and I in our pension fund, right? We wouldn't want to put that money in there if we didn't have that certainty around what is that going to be and what's the likelihood of a return on that investment and the realization of what it's going to achieve. So I think those are some of the fundamentals we need to be looking at, is that coherence is absolutely necessary. That support that is required, and that coherence is also going to help in terms of the international funding. Because when they look at us and say, well, how do we trust what it is that you're going to do? And where's the coherence and the evidence that there's the enabling environment, both from a policy perspective and from an incentive perspective? And how is that then rolled out to the different levels? The second is going to be on capacity, is that do we have capacity at the relevant tiers of government or whatever the case might be to be able to implement those changes and then follow on the ensuring the management and the longevity of that enabling environment. And so those are not the direct answers to the financing, but I'm saying that creation of an enabling environment has those factors that do need to be put in place. I also want to just maybe supplement a little bit to what Bernard said right now in relation to how we look at that funding. And hopefully I've tackled a little bit on the pension fund element and matching long-term obligations with assets, that need liabilities that you need to have to be able to ensure a return for investors. We also need to consider what are the immediate models that we can adopt within the financing mechanisms? Private sector, as has already been outlined, is happy to invest, is as long as it makes sense, right? If it's commercially viable, the money is going to flow to it anyway. But if you need to prop that up, it's about the blending of the finance and the different mechanisms that you can have. I think the pathways that Jesse already showed talked about the different NDC levels that we could commit to in the upper tier and the lower. And if we're going to keep to the lower trajectory, there is absolutely a dependence on getting that international support. Again, does it have certainty around what we're going to do, and so it can bring the money in, but also the types of finance that we necessarily need, I think, need to be on the front foot for asking about. We'll need to say, this is what the transition is going to look like. We're clear about this, and therefore this is the money that we need. And it might be a match that says less debt and more other types of financing, or this type that we can blend to be able to de-risk at a certain level, certain investments, and then above that, we're able to make it commercially viable, and the right sort of tiers of financing will then come in from the private sector, for example. So I'm just going to pause there, Neil. Hopefully that's helpful. And yeah.
Thanks, Pamela. That's a good segue into
I'm struggling to hear, Neil.
bring
I'm sorry.
Vukile in on. Is Vukile online? I think so. Okay. Maybe Vukile, if you can give an indication if you are online. So if one was to take, I mean, this kind of fiscal space approach to the debt IP, we have a 1.5 trillion estimate, and looking at all sources of financing for that 1.5 trillion, and already knowing that probably about 70% of that plan is going to be through private investment. But the public finance is also going to have to play a role in terms of leveraging a lot of that private investment. And that is likely to be not the majority coming from grants, but from concessional or deeply concessional type climate finance. Vukile, we've had very difficult conversations with the Treasury, and when we first presented the 1.5 trillion plan, there were some Treasury colleagues that gave a response that was similar to the response that former Minister Manuel used to often give us, and that is, are you smoking your socks? I'm looking at Andrew, and I think Andrew must have been thinking that when I first had this conversation of the 1.5 trillion with him. But I mean, just so the view from the Treasury in terms thinking about a constrained fiscal framework, the view of the Treasury in terms of the absorptive capacity and the appetite for more of these concessional or deeply concessional financing.
Thanks, Neil. I think I should sort of preference my remarks by saying two things. I mean, the first is that the comments I'm going to make are my own and don't necessarily represent the views of the Treasury or the Minister. The second, Neil, is that, you know, where I sit in the Financial Sector Policy Unit, clearly our focus is about leveraging private sector resources as much as possible. But like you've outlined, there's clearly going to be a need for significant public sector and private sector investment, and actually new models of how we marry these two sources of finance and share risks across the two sets of balance sheets. We've obviously come through a long period of declining efficiency and effectiveness of some state-owned entity capacity. And so we really need to think about innovative new models that can ensure that the investments that are made are I guess, efficient, can deliver on what they're meant to, leveraging on the best aspects of the private sector, which is their ability, I think, to manage complex projects and deliver them on time, whilst balancing the need for public ownership of what's clearly an important strategic asset that needs to be used more broadly in the economy. I'm going to maybe just touch on a few aspects that have been raised, and I think Shamila and the previous speaker really highlighted the need for a sort of shift in paradigm, and I think that that's a really important and useful place to start. I mean, the shift in paradigm, obviously requires us to think differently about how we build and design the framework for delivery of electricity, but also how the economy can be structured around that and the opportunities that represents, and therefore the financing that's required to get there. The trade-offs that were highlighted are critical along those dimensions. So, we need to think about what the implications are for the energy utility. We need to think about what the implications are for local financing. But we need to balance that against what the overall economy needs. So the electricity is both, I guess, just what it is, just providing the power for economic activity, but it's also increasingly in a connected world where our companies need to export their products. It will increasingly matter how they generate those goods and services, and here I'm thinking in particular of interventions coming out of Europe, like the CBAM, which will impose additional costs for those economies whose production is particularly carbon intensive, like South Africa's is. So when we think about the costs and benefits and trade-offs, we really need to take a step back and think across multiple dimensions of the cost of continuing on a particularly high carbon intensity, just the upfront cost, which were highlighted as being particularly high, but also the ongoing costs and what it means for the economy more broadly. On the regulatory certainty that Shamila was talking about, I mean, we think about it, I guess, very much like how Shamila was outlining, and there's an important need to have to provide for the regulatory certainty that will enable private sector finance to flow into the various areas that we need, both in generation and transmission and other areas. And that really needs to hinge on two key pillars. And we've worked a lot with Shamila on this, is an effective framework for disclosure, so that people need to know what they're investing in and the carbon intensity, what those investments are, and the long-term sustainability of those investments. It's particularly the case for long-term savers through pension funds and the like. We also need to define what are the projects and assets that we need to get there, and we've largely channel that through development of a taxonomy. Linked to that is through the carbon tax framework, thinking around offsets and introducing a carbon tax and a carbon price into the economy that then enables us to undertake the cost and reward the investments in the good aspects rather than the more unsustainable types of investments. Neil, I'll end off by saying that a lot of what we've been talking about, I guess, is really important for us, and the change, I think, is demonstrated by the ongoing load shedding. But it is also a change and an adjustment that I think will be increasingly forced upon us by our key trading partners, and I think that we need to bear that in mind just as much, that we're doing this for ourselves because it's the absolutely right way to go, and actually the most cost-effective way to go. But we also are going to increasingly have to deal with external pressure to have the kind of transition that the two professors have outlined. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Fikile. I promised Jess that I was going to give her between 45 seconds and 1 minute to speak about the most important part, and that is the justice part of the JET.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we've seen all those scenarios. That's technology pathways, and of course, the deployment of that technology needs to be done in the best way possible. So I think South Africa, weirdly, has actually been a leader in benefit sharing in renewables, for example. So 9% of our REAP projects are community owned. It hasn't always worked on the ground. There's lessons there, but we've tried that. We've tried local content rules. There's also been design problems, and it's been complicated. But we've at least tried to bring in those developmental aspects of this new economy, this new energy economy, which I think is critical. The other parts of just transition, and there's kind of always different ways of that people cut it. Is it looking backwards? Is it looking forwards? Is it green industrialization? Is it just workers? Is it just communities? And poor Neil always hears me say this. Like, to me, it's the symphony of interventions. So it's about building stuff, but it's also about livelihoods on the ground in a place like Mpumalanga. It's about food gardens. It's about food security. It's about education. And so you kind of have to put all of these things together in this huge plan or this huge set of projects and exploration and government programs. I think we talk a lot about projects, but a lot of this can't just happen from projects that emerge at a small scale. There has to be programmatic interventions around public employment, around grant supports, around training and education. And that actually needs government intervention. And it comes back to this, the whole discussion all day is that government is being asked and will have to deliver more with less in the coming years. And I think that's really hard. And the trade offs are really hard. And this comes back to a bigger question of injustice, which is around the climate finance regime internationally. And I hear everyone saying we're going to de-risk things and leverage and whatever, but WRI has looked at this, and for every dollar of public support that goes into climate finance in the world, you get 30 cents of private investment. So there isn't a huge unlocking of these piles of private money that's waiting to do things. And I think that's also something we need to start to unpick a little bit. And it's not just a South African problem. We may have our peculiarities. All emerging and developing economies in the world are facing a problem, which is the whole world almost. And developed economies have not delivered the $100 billion that they needed to with all the quality. I'll stop there.
Okay. So I think we've run out of time, maybe over time by about 10 minutes or so. We tried our best. So I'm not going to attempt to summarize, but maybe leave you with the following in terms of these challenges that we are facing. So in thinking about the decarbonization, I mean, we have a coal power fleet that is on average about 45 years old if you take Kusile and Medupi out of the calculation. So there are coal power stations that are coming to the end of their lifespan, and maybe sooner because of a neglect in maintenance, because the managers of the coal power stations, their bonus was linked to the EAF, the energy availability factor. So we've run down our coal power stations, and I think we're sitting at the moment on a maybe 58 to 68% average energy availability across them. I was recently in Indonesia, and one of the things we did there was to visit a coal power station in Indonesia, and the one we visited had a EAF of 98%, and the guys who were managing the plant said, we strive for 100%, but they have a 10 to 12 year on average coal fleet. But Indonesia is also has just drafted a just energy transition in investment plan, which is essentially a decarbonization plan. So they would need to retire their coal power stations a lot earlier than the lifespan of that coal power station. So they may be facing, just in terms of the pushback, it may even be a lot stronger than or forceful than in the case of South Africa. So these things are complex. I think there's a lot of unknown unknowns and maybe a few known unknowns. And it is about, I think, working in a way that requires partnership, not only local, but also international partnerships in working through this, and how the C-band that Vukile spoke of is how that's going to impact on South Africa now, and how that needs to drive the policy choices that we make going forward. So we're not on our own. We're not unique in this regard, but it is going to be a program that, if we get it right, in terms of the financing, in terms of the policy choices, the kind of technology that we're going to use, the syncing of new generation and grid expansion, I think it has many positives in terms of economic growth, the industrialization, having a more inclusive economy, and properly taking care of those workers and communities that are going to be directly affected by the transition. So exciting times ahead, but what is that curse? May you live in exciting times,
Interesting times.
in interesting times. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. One more time for Neil and Jesse. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, we've again out of time, so we're gonna request that you take a 5 minutes what do you call it? Leg stretching break. Yes, I'm gonna take a 5 minutes and then we'll be back.
Yeah.
Mamiki is on standby with the team to talk to us about more interesting topics. So 5 minutes and we are back. Thank you.